He thinks this is a playground? The words cold sliced the recycled air. Before Malik could stammer an apology, the flight attendant, Grayson, snatched a fork, not to clear the tray. No, he plunged it into Malik's thigh. Passengers gasped. This kid alone, bleeding, meant nothing to Grayson. What the idiot didn't grasp. Malik's old man just bought the damn airline. Grayson figured he was untouchable, a tin-badged tyrant in the sky. He had no idea that Malik, quiet, sketching in his pad, would unleash hell. They have no idea that his kindness will change everything. What the arrogant attendant didn't know was that Malik's father was the new owner of the airline, and the storm of justice was already on its way. By the time this flight touched the ground, the man who thought he held all the power would discover just how fast his world could collapse. Malik Benson winced slightly as the edge of the tray table grazed his knee while he settled into seat 3A. The cabin lights above flickered softly as passengers shuffled past their carry-ons, bumping against armrests and shoulders. The air was thick with recycled oxygen and the subtle scent of lemon disinfectant. A flight attendant moved briskly through the aisle, his polished black shoes clicking faintly on the cabin floor. His name tag read, Grayson. Boarding pass, the man demanded, stopping in front of Malik's row. Malik blinked, startled. He'd barely buckled his seatbelt. He looked up and found himself staring into a pair of cold, impatient eyes. Grayson towered over him, tall and stiff with neatly combed hair and a sharp jawline. His uniform was spotless, but his tone was anything but welcoming. "Oh yes, sorry," Malik stammered, fumbling to pull the folded slip from the front pocket of his hoodie. "Here you go." Grayson snatched the paper without a word and scanned it quickly. "Figures," he muttered loud enough for Malik to hear, before handing it back and walking away with a tight shake of his head. Malik sat frozen for a second. He had heard the words, the tone, the dismissiveness. He didn't know why, but it stung more than he expected. Maybe it was the way Grayson's voice cut through the cabin noise like a cold gust of wind. Or maybe it was how he didn't even pretend to smile. Malik slowly tucked the boarding pass back into his pocket, trying to convince himself it didn't matter. But it did. He shifted in his seat, glancing nervously around the cabin. The premium section was quieter, more polished than the rest of the plane. Wide seats with extra legroom screens already lit with soft blue glow and passengers sipping bottled water from actual glasses. It was supposed to be a treat. His dad had arranged it specially. Dorian Benson always did things right, organized, careful, thoughtful. Malik couldn't wait to see him again. 6 months apart had felt like forever, but now a knot had begun to form in his chest. From the corner of his eye, he caught Grayson glancing back again. That same look, as if Malik didn't belong there, as if his presence was a mistake. The boy turned toward the window, pretending to watch the baggage handlers loading suitcases below. Outside, the sun was beginning to dip low, casting long shadows across the tarmac. One of the handlers waved to a colleague, laughing about something Malik couldn't hear. It looked like a regular day for them, but for Malik, it didn't feel normal at all. He tried to calm his racing thoughts. Maybe he's just tired. Maybe he treats everyone like that, he told himself. But the words rang hollow. The overhead chime sounded. A voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We'll be departing shortly. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and all personal devices are switched to airplane mode. Estimated flight time to Stonebridge is 1 hour and 48 minutes. Malik reached for his backpack on the floor, pulling out a small sketch pad and a pencil. Drawing always helped. It distracted him from the noise, the tight spaces, and his own overthinking. He began sketching the wing of the plane, as seen from his window, letting his pencil glide across the page in soft strokes. He wasn't the best artist, but the lines calmed him. Just as he was shading the engine, a shadow fell across his lap. Grayson had returned this time, pushing a metal cart filled with snacks, drinks, and meals sealed in plastic containers. He moved efficiently, almost mechanically, until he reached Malik. Without looking at him, Grayson pulled a tray from the top of the stack and thrust it toward the boy. Malik looked up, startled. The tray tipped slightly, its contents shifting. He reached for it too slowly, and the edge of the tray caught his wrist. A metal fork clattered off the side, slipping between Malik's seat and the one beside him. I'm sorry, Malik said quickly, already leaning down to grab the fallen utensil. The tray wobbled in his lap, his sketchpad nearly slid to the floor, his face flushed with embarrassment. Grayson didn't wait for an explanation. You think this is a playground? He snapped, his voice tight and cutting. Malik looked up, still holding the fork in his hand. I didn't mean to. But before he could finish the sentence, Grayson reached down into the cart, pulled another metal fork from the stack, and in one swift motion, jabbed it into Malik's upper thigh. The pain was immediate, sharp, unexpected, deep. Malik gasped loudly, his mouth open in shock. The fork dropped from Grayson's hand and clinked against the plastic tray. Blood instantly began to bloom through the fabric of Malik's jeans, a dark circle spreading outward. He couldn't breathe, couldn't speak. A man in the aisle seat beside him, a middle-aged passenger with a travel pillow around his neck, jumped up. What are you doing? He shouted, eyes wide in disbelief. Grayson took a step back, hands raised, his face suddenly pale but controlled. It was an accident, he said flatly. The tray slipped. The other man didn't look convinced. That wasn't a tray. You stabbed him. Passengers across the aisle had turned their heads. A few had risen slightly in their seats. The cabin fell into a thick, stunned silence. No one moved. Malik sat frozen, his fingers gripping the tray. His leg on fire, his mouth trembled, but no sound came out. Grayson glanced around, eyes darting quickly from seat to seat. Then, with practiced coldness, he leaned forward and said, Sit down, sir. Everything's under control. The man hesitated clearly, wanting to argue, but after a few tense seconds, he sat reluctantly, still glaring at the flight attendant. Grayson turned and pushed the cart forward without another word. Malik stared down at his leg. Blood soaked the denim hot and wet against his skin. His hands began to shake. He wanted to scream, to cry, but the fear locked his throat. He could hear his heart pounding in his ears, the hum of the engines, the clink of plastic trays, a faint murmur of voices. No one had come to help him. He pressed his hand gently against the wound, gasping as pain flared again. Across the aisle, the man who had shouted earlier now pulled out his phone. He angled it carefully, discreetly. A red record light blinked. Malik didn't see it. He was staring ahead, his body, rigid eyes burning with unshed tears. He couldn't make sense of it. Why had Grayson done that? Why wasn't anyone helping? And why, most of all, wasn't his father here? The cabin dimmed as the plane left the ground, and through it all, Malik sat in silence, not knowing that just a few hours from now, the name of his father would turn this quiet cabin into a battleground. He had no idea this flight would change everything. The fork hit the floor with a faint clatter, barely audible over the hum of the engines. Malik Benson instinctively reached down between the seats to retrieve it, his fingers brushing the cool metal as he sat back up, face flushed with embarrassment. I'm sorry. Malik began holding the fork out with both hands, his voice small. Gay didn't wait for the apology to land. With a sharp movement, deliberate and cold, he snatched a fresh fork from the tray cart and drove it into the soft flesh of Malik's thigh. The pain was instant, hot and blinding. Malik's scream tore through the air, sharp and panicked. His body twisted in the seat, one hand flying to his leg, the other gripping the armrest so tightly his knuckles turned white. Blood bloomed beneath the denim of his jeans, darkening the fabric in seconds. What are you doing? Shouted the man seated beside Malik, shooting to his feet, his eyes wide with disbelief. He looked from Malik's leg to Grayson's empty hand, then down at the fork, now bent and crimson-stained. Grayson's face froze. For a heartbeat, he didn't move. Then, with calculated indifference, he stepped back, set the tray down on an empty seat, and lifted his hand slightly. It was an accident, he said flatly. His voice was even practiced. He startled me. I didn't see him move. The man beside Malik, tall-bearded, somewhere in his 40s, glared at the flight attendant. That wasn't an accident. You stabbed a kid. Grayson's eyes flicked to the surrounding passengers. A few had turned in their seats, their brows furrowed murmurs as beginning to ripple, but no one else stood up. No one else spoke. The cabin, already dim for service, felt suffocating, heavy with tension. Malik hunched forward, trying to breathe through the pain. His hands trembled as he pressed his sleeve against the wound, but it only made it worse. The fabric stuck to the injury. His leg throbbed so hard he felt it in his stomach. Tears blurred his vision, but he refused to cry out again. He bit the inside of his cheek instead. Grayson leaned down just enough to speak without others hearing. "If you make another sound," he said, lips barely moving, "I'll tell the captain you were being violent. Think they'll believe a kid flying alone." Malik blinked, stunned. The threat struck harder than the fork. He stared at the man's face, expressionless, uncaring, and shrank back into his seat. Across the aisle, an older man adjusted his earbuds and turned his phone camera toward the scene, angling it just enough to be discreet. His name was Vernon. Silver hair curled over his ears, and he wore a pressed button-down with sleeves rolled to the elbows. He had watched everything. He had heard the cry, seen the motion, the blood, the fear, and now he had it on video. Grayson glanced his way for a split second, but turned away just as quickly, opting to continue his food service like nothing had happened. His face was composed, but there was something brittle in his jawline, something uncertain, like he knew. Deep down, the moment had slipped from his control. The man next to Malik sat down slowly, unsure of what to do. "Hang in there, kid," he muttered, pulling his seatbelt tighter, eyes locked on the flight attendant, now moving 2 rows up. He looked around again, hoping another passenger might back him up, but they all sat frozen, some pretending not to have seen anything, others too stunned to intervene. The pilot's voice came on over the intercom, calm and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're expecting a patch of turbulence shortly. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." It gave Grayson cover. No one would question him for staying out of reach for a while. No one would press too hard. Not yet. Malik pressed the call button on his armrest. The light blinked above, glowing like a flare in the dim cabin. Grayson turned slowly, saw it, and returned with a forced smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You again?" he asked, keeping his tone pleasant for nearby passengers. "My leg, it's bleeding," Malik whispered, his voice barely audible. Grayson bent slightly and leaned in his breath, warm and sour. "You say one more word," he hissed, "and I'll make sure they think you attacked me, little brat." Malik recoiled, the fear anchoring itself deep in his chest. He looked down again at the blood now drying into his jeans, and then toward the window, trying to focus on the clouds instead of the stabbing pain or the threat that hung over him like a storm. Grayson straightened and walked away. Vernon, still filming quietly from across the aisle, tapped his phone screen and minimized the video. His expression darkened. He recognized the boy. During his cybersecurity onboarding at Aeromax Air 2 weeks earlier, he'd seen a family photo during a slideshow introducing the new CEO, Dorian Benson. This boy was Malik Benson. He didn't hesitate. Vernon tapped the messaging app and opened a secure line to a contact labeled DB. He typed quickly, "Emergency, your son flight 917 hurt. I have video." He hit send. Seconds later, the reply came. What happened? Vernon swallowed hard and glanced across the aisle again. Malik's head was leaning against the window, now his eyes half closed, his shoulders trembling slightly. With each shallow breath, the tension in Vernon's jaw hardened into resolve. Grayson had made a mistake, a brutal, irreversible one, and Vernon had just pulled the first thread in what was about to become a very public unraveling. And all the while, no one knew that the boy's father was the new owner of the airline. Malik's thumb hovered for only a second before he pressed the service button. The small circular light above him blinked silently, signaling his call. His heart pounded in rhythm with the ache in his leg. Blood had soaked a dark patch through the denim, and the pain pulsed deeper than the puncture. He clenched his jaw, willing himself not to cry again, not to look weak. Look, but it hurt badly. And more than the pain, it was the confusion, the disbelief. How could an adult hurt a kid like that and just move on? Footsteps approached. Heavy, annoyed, Grayson appeared again at the edge of Malik's row, arms crossed tightly, lips pulled in a thin line. The overhead lights flickered slightly as the plane adjusted altitude. He didn't kneel. He didn't even lean forward, just glared down. "What do you want now?" he asked, his voice low, but sharp enough to cut. Malik swallowed. He felt the heat of eyes from nearby passengers, but couldn't tell if anyone would speak up. He dared to look up at Grayson's voice, almost a whisper. "My leg! It's bleeding! I need help!" Grayson's jaw tensed. His eyes darted to the stained denim, then to the aisle, then back to Malik. He leaned in close enough that Malik could smell the coffee on his breath. "You say one more word," Grayson muttered, his voice venomous, "and I'll tell everyone you attacked me first." The words hit like a slap. Malik froze, not just because of fear, but confusion. He didn't understand how someone could lie so easily, how someone in uniform with power could turn the truth upside down. His lip trembled. His eyes welled up again, but he blinked hard, refusing to let the tears fall. Grayson stood there for a second longer, waiting for a reaction. Then, with a fake smile, he turned and walked away down the aisle, his posture relaxed as if nothing had happened at all. Across the aisle, Vernon Caldwell adjusted his headphones, but he wasn't listening to music. His Bluetooth setting flashed on his screen, but the sound was off. The old man had watched it all. He had seen the stabbing, the aftermath, and now this, the threat, the dismissal, the boy's silence. He looked at Malik. The child sat rigid, eyes locked on the seat back in front of him, shoulders stiff. There was something familiar about the boy's face, something Vernon had seen before, not in person, but in a staff orientation slideshow. Suddenly it clicked. The chin, the brow, the sharp gaze. Despite the trembling lip, Malik Benson, son of Dorian Benson, the new owner of Aeromax Air, Vernon's pulse kicked up. This wasn't just a case of an unruly flight attendant. This wasn't just abuse. This was a firebomb waiting to detonate in the heart of the airline, and no one on board seemed to realize it. But he did. Vernon leaned forward slightly, checking the aisle. Grayson was 3 rows down now, speaking with another passenger. Vernon unbuckled his belt, stood up casually, and rubbed his lower back as if stretching. "I'm just going to stretch my legs," he said to no one in particular. He walked slowly toward the back, passing the galley where 2 attendants stood chatting. Neither noticed him as he slipped into the narrow space beside the rear laboratory. He pulled his phone from his coat pocket and quickly unlocked it. The video was already saved, captured just after the fork had landed on the floor. He had filmed discreetly, the lens angled just right. He had Grayson's hand, the sudden jab, Malik's cry, the blood, and now the threat. The audio had picked up every word. Vernon didn't hesitate. He opened his messaging app, tapped a name already pinned to the top. Dorian Benson. His fingers flew across the screen. "Emergency. Your son, Flight 917, hurt. I have video. Your son's been stabbed with a fork by a crew member. I got it on video. He's bleeding." Vernon's voice was low, urgent, barely more than a whisper through the phone speaker. On the other end, Dorian Benson stood in a glass-walled conference room on the 19th floor of Aeromax headquarters, his back to a long table cluttered with notes from the press call he just walked out on. He didn't speak at first. His mind, sharp and tactical by nature, ran through the implications like a silent thunderclap. He had expected turbulence today of the corporate kind. Acquisition resistance from legacy staff union nerves. But this was not turbulence. This was fire. "Is he safe now?" Dorian asked, his voice remarkably steady. Despite the pressure mounting behind his temples, he stared at the far skyline, his reflection in the window betraying none of the storm brewing inside. "Not yet," Vernon replied. "They're not helping him. I think the flight attendant is trying to cover it up. His name is Grayson. I saw him threaten the boy after the stab. Malik's in shock." Dorian's jaw tensed, his throat tightened, but his voice held. "Stay with him. Don't make a scene. Just record everything. I'm on it." The call ended with a faint click, and Dorian's entire posture changed. His frame straightened, his expression sharpened, and his next moves came rapid fire. He stormed out of the conference room, his assistant, Lucas, trailing behind him, confused. "Sir, is the call over?" "Family emergency," Dorian said without looking back. "I need you to patch me through to 3 lines. Chief of In-Flight Security, Director of Cabin Operations, Director of Ground Response at Stonebridge." Now Lucas nodded and darted toward the communications desk. Within minutes, Dorian was locked inside a private control room with 3 blinking lights on the phone panel in front of him. He pressed the buttons one by one, his voice clipped, composed, lethal. This is Benson. I need full immediate oversight on Flight 917. We've had an incident involving crew on passenger assault. Minor injured. Get eyes on the jet. When it lands, I want it sealed and secured. No one leaves until internal response meets that aircraft on the bridge. Clear. All three voices on the other end gave overlapping affirmations. But Dorian didn't wait for debate. I want footage, body cam, passenger video, and any prior history on that crew member, Grayson Monroe. Pull his record. If there's even one red flag, I want it flagged. He ended the call. Across the room, screens flickered with tracking data. Flight 917 was still in the air, coasting at $31,000 FTA to Stonebridge, just over an hour. To the untrained eye, it was just another dot in the sky. To Dorian, it was a slow-moving time bomb, one that had just detonated on a personal level. Back on the flight, Malik sat in silence, one hand gripping the armrest, the other pressed over his bleeding thigh. His eyes were red, but he hadn't cried again. Not since the initial shock. Grayson had passed by once more, and with a lowered voice said, "Better not say a word when we land." Malik didn't reply. He simply turned his face toward the window, trying to force his breathing into a quiet rhythm. The pain was real, but so was the fear. He didn't fully understand what was happening, why someone who was supposed to help had hurt him, why no one else had stepped in, and what would happen when the plane landed. Behind him, Vernon sat still as stone. He'd returned to his seat, but hadn't stopped watching. Every time Grayson walked by, Vernon's fingers twitched. He had the footage backed up 3 times, one on the cloud, one on a hard drive built into his smartwatch, one on a private network that routed through Airmac's internal servers. He didn't trust coincidence, and he didn't trust silence. The flight, though calm on the surface, was now a battlefield of secrets. Grayson thought his smirk was still armor. He moved down the aisle as though nothing had happened. He poured drinks, smiled flatly, reached into overhead compartments to assist passengers, but his eyes never drifted toward Vernon again. He must have known the recording had happened, or maybe he didn't care. Either way, the clock was ticking. Dorian, back at HQ, watched a screen that now showed the security teams assembling at Stonebridge. He spoke once more into his direct line. Have the bridge team wear plain uniform. No panic, but once doors open, no one moves. The name's Grayson Monroe. Isolate him calmly, professionally. I want him escorted without warning. A beat of silence passed. Then copy that, sir. In the seat beside Vernon, a passenger shifted. Malik's breathing hitched for a moment. Vernon leaned forward just slightly and tapped out one more message on his device. This time, it was not to internal Airmax security. It was to Dorian's personal line. Emergency. Your son. Flight 917 hurt. I have video. The reply came less than 10 seconds later. What happened? Vernon typed back carefully, deliberately, stabbed in leg with a fork. Crew member named Grayson. I have full footage. Malik bleeding. They aren't helping him. There was no reply this time, but Vernon knew what that meant. He didn't need a thank you. He didn't need instructions. He had worked with Dorian long enough to know that silence from the top only meant one thing. The engine had been switched on. Inside the flight cabin, tension pulsed like electricity under the surface. The passengers didn't know it, but their aircraft was now being tracked, not just for altitude or weather, but for truth. Every second in the air brought them closer to a confrontation Grayson could never prepare for. He had hurt a child, and not just any child. Vernon glanced sideways at Malik, who sat with lips pressed tight, eyes shining but defiant. Grayson passed again, avoiding eye contact, and Vernon whispered under his breath. What Grayson didn't know was that he had just ruined his life on camera. The moment the wheels of Flight 91 touched the runway, a jolt ran through the cabin. But for Malik Benson, it wasn't turbulence that made him flinch. It was the sharp ache in his leg, still burning from where the metal fork had pierced through his jeans into his skin. Blood had dried around the edges, crusting against the fabric. His small hands gripped the armrest tightly, knuckles, pale jaw clenched. He didn't cry anymore. He was past that. Now he was just waiting for the pain to stop, for someone to help, for his father to appear. But all he could see were strangers and Grayson. The flight attendant moved casually down the aisle, checking seatbelts and tray tables as if nothing had happened. He gave Malik only a brief glance, eyes cold and unreadable before moving on. Passengers whispered. A few stole glances at the dried blood on Malik's jeans, at his pale face and trembling hands, but no one spoke. No one stood. Some looked away as if pretending not to see would make it less real. In seat 11C, Vernon Reeves tapped the edge of his phone with a finger, eyes flicking between the screen and the aisle. The video, grainy but clear, was saved in 3 secure cloud drives and 1 encrypted flash. The frame showed exactly what had happened. The sudden jab, the boy's cry, and Grayson's calm denial. Vernon wasn't an emotional man, but his jaw had been tight since the moment he hit record. He sent another message to Ground Marshal Desmond Rusk. Message Gate 12. Red alert. Be ready. Confirm. A reply came within seconds. Confirmed. Armed response on standby. As the aircraft rolled toward its gate, a new alert blinked across the cockpit screen. The pilot, a seasoned man in his 50s named Captain Hadley, furrowed his brow. The message from tower control was direct. Hold position after docking. Special security team will meet aircraft. Do not release passengers until instructed. That was unusual. He leaned over and said quietly to his co-pilot. Looks like we've got something waiting for us. In the back of the aircraft, Grayson was humming under his breath. He smoothed out the front of his uniform, adjusted his tie, and gave a fake smile to a passenger in row 22. He felt in control again. No one had said anything. No one had stopped him. The boy had gone quiet. Whatever storm might have come, it had passed. He couldn't have been more wrong. As the plane eased into its final stop at Gate 12, Grayson turned toward the front, ready to open the cabin door and begin the usual disembarkation speech. But then he paused. Through the tiny window of the front door, he saw them. 6 men, all in dark uniform, standing shoulder to shoulder at the end of the jet bridge. No airline staff, no friendly faces, just stern eyes, folded arms, and the glint of badges. Grayson's breath caught for a moment, but he quickly straightened. Maybe it was a drill. Maybe they were for someone else. A voice crackled over the cabin intercom, calm but firm. Ladies and gentlemen, we ask that all passengers remain seated for a brief onboard security check. Please stay in your seats until instructed to disembark. A ripple moved through the cabin. Confusion. Concern. Grayson blinked. His hand hovered over the intercom switch. He turned to the nearest flight attendant, another man named Carl, and muttered, "What's this about?" Carl shook his head, looking just as surprised. No clue. Then came the moment Grayson hadn't anticipated. Vernon stood without hesitation. He walked down the aisle, passengers craning their necks, and stopped at the front row. He turned toward the lead officer, who had just boarded. Vernon held up his phone and spoke clearly, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "This is the kid," he said, pointing at Malik. His tone held no tremble, no hesitation. "This is what he did." He handed the phone over. The officer didn't even ask questions. He simply looked at the screen, watched for 6 seconds, then nodded. He handed the phone to the man behind him and stepped forward. "Mr. Grayson Monroe," he said in an even tone. "Please come with us?" Grayson blinked, frozen. "Wait, what's going on?" he asked, his voice high and thin. Now his hands hovered in the air as if trying to push away invisible hands. One of the other agents stepped forward. "You just attacked the new owner's son." Grayson's face drained of color. His lips parted, but no sound came out. Passengers began murmuring. Someone gasped. Others turned to see Malik, now sitting rigid, eyes wide, watching the scene unfold. The young boy didn't move. He didn't speak, but the flicker of shock and hope in his eyes said everything. 2 agents flanked Grayson and gently but firmly pulled his hands behind his back. The click of metal cuffs echoed louder than the engine hum. Grayson didn't fight, didn't speak, didn't even blink. The men walked him down the aisle as passengers parted, some filming, others whispering. Grayson's head stayed low, his steps stiff. No one smiled, no one clapped, but every soul on board knew they had witnessed something real, and the world was about to find out. The sound of Grayson's shoes scraping against the jet bridge floor echoed with each reluctant step, broken only by the sharp click of handcuffs locked tightly around his wrists. His breathing was erratic, loud, ragged, panicked. Uniformed officers on either side gripped his arms firmly, showing no sign of sympathy. Behind them, the cabin of Flight 91 Seamean remained frozen in stunned silence. Passengers leaned out into the aisle, eyes wide, some whispering to their neighbors, others simply staring, unable to process what they had just witnessed. Inside, Malik Benson sat motionless, his legs still throbbing beneath the torn fabric of his jeans. The pain radiated upward in hot waves, but he clenched his jaw, refusing to cry again. His eyes remained fixed on the narrow space where Grayson had disappeared. A faint trail of blood stained the aisle carpet near his feet. The air around him felt thick and hollow. He didn't understand everything that had just happened, but he knew enough to recognize fear when he saw it. A male officer stepped forward through the curtain, separating first class from the galley. He moved with purpose, but softened as he neared Malik. He knelt beside the boy and lowered his voice. "Hey, buddy," the officer said gently, eyes level with Malik's. "Your dad's waiting for you." Malik blinked. His lips parted, but no words came. The weight of the moment pressed down on him. Then slowly he nodded. The officer helped him to his feet, steadying him as he winced and shifted weight off his injured leg. A second crew member, this one unfamiliar and visibly shaken, rolled a wheelchair into place. Careful not to make eye contact with anyone, he lowered it, and Malik eased into the seat with a muffled groan. Passengers murmured behind cupped hands as the small procession made its way down the aisle. Some turned away as they passed, unable to face the shame of their silence earlier. Others simply watched, eyes hollow with guilt. The man who had recorded the incident, Vernon, stood as they passed. His phone was still in his hand, locked but trembling slightly. He said nothing, only gave Malik a small nod as he followed behind. The cabin door hissed open. Beyond it, a stark hallway of polished tiles and airport lighting stretched into the distance. But at the gate, standing just inside the threshold, was a tall, broad-shouldered man in a navy blue suit. His hands were clasped in front of him. Two security officers flanked him, but their presence felt secondary. All eyes locked onto the man at the center, Dorian Benson. His gaze scanned the group, instantly landing on the boy in the wheelchair. The moment their eyes met, his expression shifted. Anger softened into aching relief, tension melting into quiet fury. Without a word, Dorian stepped forward. He dropped it to one knee in front of his son, his suits creasing his hands steady as they rested on either side of the chair. "I'm here, son," he said, voice low and full of steel and sorrow. Malik's lip trembled, his eyes filled again, but he blinked hard, refusing to let the tears fall. "Dad, he really stabbed me." Dorian closed his eyes briefly, his jaw tightening as he exhaled slowly. The hallway around them seemed to blur the noise, dulling beneath the weight of his silence. When he opened his eyes again, they were blazing with quiet fire. "I know," he said. "I saw the footage." He didn't pull Malik into a hug. Not yet. Instead, he straightened his jacket and turned sharply toward the head of airport security, a tall, square-jawed man in his 50s named Chief Erston, who had arrived just moments before the plane landed. "Every legal procedure must be followed." Dorian stated, his voice loud enough to silence the gate area. "I want an internal investigation started tonight. Full review of Grayson Monroe's history and anyone who ever signed off on his behavior." Rustin nodded, recognizing that this wasn't a request. "Understood." Dorian's eyes flicked to the cameras mounted in the corners, to the passengers still seated inside the plane, and finally to a young male reporter loitering near a column with his phone half raised. "And make sure the media doesn't twist this story. We're controlling the narrative. No spin, no half-truths. I won't let this be turned into something it's not." He turned back to Malik. For a moment, the fury behind his eyes gave way to warmth. He reached out, placing a firm hand on his son's shoulder, anchoring him. "I promised I'd protect you," he said softly, so only Malik could hear. And now the entire airline was about to feel the weight of that promise. The sterile, hushed atmosphere of Aeromax's operations center did little to calm the rising storm within Dorian Benson. A quiet panic, almost imperceptible to an outsider, had already begun to ripple through the highly trained staff. Dorian's assistant, Lucas, a man known for his meticulous efficiency, stood before him, a stack of digital reports glowing on his tablet. He had already compiled the crucial documents, the flight manifest of Flight 917, Grayson Monroe's entire personnel record, and a detailed chart of the current chain of command within in-flight operations. Each file was a potential piece of a disturbing puzzle. Dorian walked in his presence, immediately commanding attention, even as his focus remained entirely on his son Malik. His face pale and eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and pain sat carefully beside him, his jeans still showing a faint dark stain where the makeshift bandage clung to his injured leg. The contrast between the boy's vulnerability and the immense power Dorian now wielded was stark attention that hummed in the air around them. Dorian's voice, though low and controlled, carried an unmistakable edge of resolve that silenced the room. "Tell me everything about Grayson Monroe." He ordered, his gaze fixed on Lucas. Lucas swallowed a barely audible click in the quiet room. He adjusted his glasses, his fingers tapping almost imperceptibly on the tablet screen. 10 years with the airline, sir." He began, his voice tight with professional deference. 2 prior complaints on his record, one for verbal abuse, another for a use of force claim on a different flight. Both were dismissed. Dorian's eyes narrowed, a muscle in his jaw clenching. The dismissals immediately raised a red flag. This wasn't just about a rogue employee. It was about a system that allowed such behavior to persist. By whom? He pressed his voice like a low rumble before a storm. Lucas hesitated, a flicker of discomfort crossing his features. He knew the answer would displease his new boss, the Vice President of Cabin Operations, Sir Martin Kellum. The name hung in the air, a sour taste in Dorian's mouth. Martin Kellum. The very name stung. Kellum had been flagged in Dorian's initial assessments of the company's leadership, a figure known for his ruthless efficiency in cutting corners, and more disturbingly, for his knack for burying inconvenient incidents to protect public relations numbers. This wasn't just a coincidence. It felt like a direct link to the rot he suspected festered within Aramax. The thought of his son being a victim of such systemic negligence fueled a quiet fury within him. "Bring him in now," Dorian commanded, his voice devoid of any warmth, sealing Kellum's fate with those 3 sharp words. Meanwhile, Malik sat quietly, his eyes darting around the sophisticated control center. The flashing lights of the monitor, the hushed conversations, the palpable tension in the room. It was all overwhelming, a world away from the ordinary school day he had envisioned. He still couldn't quite believe that any of this was real, that his father, the man who had always been a rock of stability, now owned this sprawling, complex entity. "I didn't know you owned the whole airline," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the low hum of the machinery. Dorian turned, his stern expression softening as he met his son's gaze. He knelt, bringing himself closer to Malik's level, a rare moment of vulnerability in the midst of the escalating crisis. "You were going to find out today," he said, his hand briefly resting on Malik's uninjured knee. "I just didn't want it to be like this." The unspoken sentiment was heavy between them. This revelation was meant to be a joyful surprise, a new chapter, not a consequence of trauma. Outside the thick, soundproofed walls of the operations center, the news was already beginning to leak, seeping into the vast interconnected world. A few quick-thinking passengers, still shaken by the incident, had already posted vague tweets about a disturbance on Flight 91, about a child being hurt, about an emergency landing. The digital whispers were the first tremors of what would soon become a full-blown earthquake. In a private room down the hall, Vernon, the tech investigator, sat hunched over his laptop, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He was meticulously reviewing every frame of the video footage he had captured, zooming in, enhancing the audio. The sharp, chilling sound of Grayson's threat to Malik, muttered under his breath, echoed faintly from the speakers. "You say one more word and I'll tell everyone you attacked me." Vernon's face was grim. He muttered to himself, a low prophetic warning that carried the weight of experience. They weren't just dealing with a lawsuit. He whispered, the gravity of the situation sinking in deeper with every replay. They were about to deal with a legacy-level reckoning, and Dorian wasn't leaving any stone unturned. If that moment made your blood boil and your heartache, don't scroll. Subscribe and become a member, because silence protects abusers, not children. Martin Kellum strolled into the conference room like a man walking into a friendly brunch, not a disciplinary hearing. His suit was pressed, his silver cufflinks caught the light, and a self-satisfied smirk played across his lips. He extended a hand toward Dorian Benson. "Dorian," he said smoothly, as if they were old colleagues meeting for coffee. Dorian didn't move, his eyes locked onto Kellum's with an unreadable intensity. "Sit," he said flatly. The room was tense. The conference table stretched between them like a drawn line. Malik sat quietly in the corner, his bandaged leg elevated, flanked by Vernon and Lucas. A tablet rested in Vernon's lap, paused on a damning image. Grayson Monroe's hand gripping the metal fork just before it made contact with Malik's leg. Kellum's smile faltered slightly, but he took a seat, adjusting his tie. "I heard there was some confusion." Dorian cut him off by tapping the screen. The video resumed, audio clear and sharp. The jab, the cry, the blood. Then came the moment that made everyone in the room flinch. Grayson's muttered threat to frame the boy. Dorian froze the video on Grayson's face, his expression cold and uncaring. "This is what your leadership has protected," Dorian said, his voice low but sharp. "I want an explanation." Kellum leaned back in his chair. The confidence didn't vanish, but it cracked. "There's always context," he said carefully. "Flight attendants deal with high stress. You've got passengers with attitudes, delays, last-minute changes. It's not always black and white." Dorian's stare didn't waver. "He stabbed a child in the leg," he said, voice rising just enough to cut the air. "A child sitting in premium class. My son." The silence that followed was dense. Even the soft hum of the central air system seemed to fade. Malik didn't speak, but his eyes never left Kellum's face. Vernon broke the stillness, tapping a few commands on his tablet. "There's also a pattern," he said, sliding the device across the table. "I pulled archived internal reports. 6 unresolved complaints tied to Grayson Monroe over the past year alone, all either closed without investigation or removed from the complaint system entirely." Kellum hesitated. That data wasn't verified. Some passengers file complaints just because a crew member didn't smile enough. Lucas stepped in, now holding a printed folder. Except these weren't about tone. One mentioned physical intimidation, another alleged racial bias. The rest include key words like verbal aggression and threatening behavior. All of them were marked as no action required under your signature. Dorian stood slowly. His chair made no sound, but the gravity of his motion was unmistakable. "Effective immediately, you're suspended. Your credentials are revoked, and our legal team will follow up by morning. Until then, you are not to contact any Aeromax employee, board member, or staff." Kellum's mouth fell open, the words catching in his throat. He stood the chair screeching behind him. "You can't do this. I've been with this airline longer than I already did," Dorian said, his voice like steel, sliding from a sheath. 2 security officers entered from the hallway, summoned silently by a text moments earlier. One stood behind Kellum, the other opened the door. There was no need for force, just presence. Kellum's expression shifted from fury to something closer to disbelief. He walked out stiffly, not looking back. Once the door closed, the room exhaled. Dorian turned to his son, whose eyes were wide with silent awe and something deeper. Trust. He knelt beside him, one hand resting lightly on Malik's shoulder. "What happens to Grayson now?" Malik asked, his voice quiet but steady. Dorian didn't blink. "We let the law handle it, but we're going to clean every corner of this airline, and we'll start with everyone who thought they were untouchable." The morning light filtered through the tall glass windows of Dorian Benson's office, casting sharp angles of sunlight across the polished conference table. The atmosphere inside, however, was anything but peaceful. The video footage Vernon had captured the moment Grayson drove a metal fork into Malik's leg had just gone live. Not leaked, not shared in some chaotic social media whirlwind, but strategically released. Dorian's legal team had spent the night trimming every unnecessary second, removing audio commentary and making sure only the truth stood raw, unforgiving, and powerful. Across digital screens, the headline lit up in bold. "Boy injured by flight attendant airline CEO's son, the victim." The story spread like wildfire. Within minutes, social media was flooded with reactions. most filled with outrage, disbelief, and demands for immediate justice. Hashtags trended. Comment sections exploded. But Dorian didn't flinch. He sat at the head of the long conference table, surrounded by his core team, legal advisors, PR strategists, internal affairs leads. The air buzzed with tension, the low hum of a dozen devices receiving alerts, emails, and calls nonstop. Vernon stood by the window, arms folded, gaze fixed on his phone. "They're calling it a scandal," he muttered. "Most people are still assuming it was an accident, but some, they're catching the details. They're putting it together." Dorian didn't lift his eyes. He simply said, "Good." The youngest of the PR team, a nervous man named Felix, cleared his throat. "Sir, we should expect backlash. Questions about whether this is personal revenge, about why you're pushing the video now. Media might think we're trying to control the story too tightly." Dorian looked up slowly, his voice even and cold. "Of course we're controlling it. That's the point. We don't feed chaos. We feed facts." At that moment, the door opened. A tall man in a charcoal suit stepped inside. It was Jordan Price, Dorian's legal director, his expression unreadable as he approached. "Gas Monroe has been arrested," Jordan announced. His voice cut through the room like a blade. 3 charges: assault on a minor, intent to cause bodily harm, and obstruction of emergency aid. For a moment, silence fell. No one moved. Vernon let out a low breath, but Dorian remained perfectly still. "Is he still in custody?" Dorian asked. "Booked downtown. No bail posted yet. We've also filed a preliminary civil claim. We'll be serving him formally by tomorrow morning." "No settlements," Jordan said firmly. "Good," Dorian replied, his fingers tapping once against the table's surface. "Make sure the judge knows exactly who tried to bury previous complaints. We're building more than a case. We're building precedent." Across the hall, the door opened again. This time it was Malik. The boy walked in slowly, still favoring his injured leg. The lounge he'd been resting in was quiet, but the silence in the conference room was heavier. All eyes turned to him, and for a moment, Dorian's entire posture changed. His shoulders softened, his jaw relaxed. "Dad," Malik said, voice small but steady. Dorian stood immediately, walking over. "Yeah, son." Malik looked up at him, something different in his eyes now. Not fear, not even confusion, just a quiet clarity. "Are you sure you want to do all this?" he asked. The room grew still again. Dorian looked down at his son, searching his face, not for permission, but for understanding. His answer came slowly but without doubt. "No one touches my son and walks away," he said, resting a hand gently on Malik's shoulder. "Not now, not ever." And justice was just getting started. The metal door slammed shut behind him with a hollow echo. Grayson Monroe flinched at the sound, his hands cuffed in front of him, the cold steel biting into his wrists. He had spent years barking orders at passengers walking aisles like he owned the sky. But now, seated on a metal bench inside a holding cell, that wryer of sweat and bleach, the power he once clung to, had dissolved. His back pressed against the wall, he stared ahead, unfocused lips parted as though he was still trying to process how he had ended up here. A single fluorescent bulb flickered overhead, casting an unforgiving glare across the small space. No one had spoken to him in the past 2 hours except for the officer who fingerprinted him without a word. The silence was crushing. He shifted uncomfortably still, wearing his Navy crew uniform, the wings on his chest now feeling like lead. His arrogance had drained away during the interrogation, replaced by a grim realization. This was real. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't something his supervisor could smooth over. He had seen the headlines through the small screen in the intake room. "Airline CEO's son assaulted by flight attendant." The words felt like a punch. Malik. That was the boy's name. He hadn't cared to remember it before. To him, the kid had just been a nuisance in premium seating, someone he thought didn't belong. He hadn't cared who the boy was until the world told him. Now he was alone. The union representative he called had responded with a tight voice. "You're on your own for this one, Grayson." His regular attorney refused to take the case without full prepayment. Back at Aramac's headquarters, Dorian Benson stood before a wide digital display in a glass-walled conference room, arms folded tightly over his chest. His eyes scanned the data streaming down the screen. Years of employee complaint logs, incident reports, and internal emails now being recompiled under a newly launched initiative he had personally named Clean Skies. "Bring up the historical misconduct files," Dorian instructed. His voice was low but carried the weight of command. Across from him, Vernon tapped swiftly on a tablet, the screen casting a blue hue across his focused face. "I've gone through the last 10 years, Vernon said, dragging a document into the main feed. 18 crew members with serious complaints, violence, neglect, repeated misconduct. Most never followed up. Almost all share one thing in common: no formal disciplinary action." Dorian's jaw tightened. Start interviews, no leniency. The tension in the room deepened. Outside the glass walls, staff moved with urgency. Security officers were scanning employee access points, HR teams combing through files, and tech engineers reviewing tamper logs in the complaint database. This wasn't just about Malik anymore. In a private room down the hall, Malik sat with his hands folded in his lap, his posture rigid despite the bandage still wrapped around his leg. Across from him sat Dr. Raiden Knox, a man in his mid-40s with a gentle but alert demeanor. A notepad rested in his lap, but he didn't write yet. He listened. "Tell me what happened after he handed you the tray," Raiden said softly. Malik hesitated. "I dropped the fork by accident. I tried to say sorry. He just looked angry, like I wasn't supposed to be there." Raiden nodded but didn't interrupt. "Then he stabbed me," Malik said, his voice shaking only slightly. "He didn't help. He told me if I said anything, he'd say I attacked him." Raiden's eyes narrowed just a fraction. "And what did you do then?" "I stayed quiet," Malik whispered, "but I pressed the button. I hoped someone else would come." Raiden paused. His pen moved now, careful, deliberate strokes. When the interview ended, he stood and gently placed a hand on Malik's shoulder before walking out. He stepped into the hallway, leaned against the wall, and opened his notepad. At the very top, in block letters, he wrote, "Intent, pattern, culture, rot." He closed the cover eyes sharp. Down the hall, Vernon approached with a list of names for internal review, and Dorian joined them seconds later. "What did he say?" Dorian asked quietly, nodding toward the interview room. Raiden handed him the notepad without a word. Dorian scanned the line, his fingers tightening around the leather cover. "Burn it down," he muttered. "Burn out every last trace." And as the screen inside the operations center lit up with one name after another, red flags flaring against years of ignored warnings, Dorian Benson set his eyes forward, not on revenge, but on reconstruction. And Dorian Benson was going to burn out every last trace of it. The microphone crackled for a brief second before Dorian Benson stepped up to the podium, his suit crisp, his posture unshaken. Behind him stood a solid wall of authority. Vernon with his arms crossed, Dr. Raiden Knox reviewing a set of documents in his hand, and 3 members of Dorian's legal team flanking them like sentinels. The seal of Aeromax Air was draped across the backdrop, large and unmistakable. The press had gathered fast. Cameras clicked like insects in heat, and murmurs filled the air like static. But when Dorian began speaking, the noise stopped. "My son was assaulted by someone we trusted to ensure passenger safety." He said, his voice even but with an edge that cut through the silence like steel. "But this isn't about a single bad apple. This is about the barrel that let him rot." There was no hesitation, no apology masked in legal softness. He was declaring war on the rot within his own company, and everyone present knew it. He continued laying out a clear plan that no executive in the industry had dared to implement until now. Starting today, all passenger complaints will be reviewed by an independent civilian board, not Aeromax staff. A new oversight system will allow passengers to submit real-time reports directly through the in-flight interface anonymously if they choose. And every single cabin crew member will undergo retraining, empathy-based, trauma-informed, and overseen by external evaluators. A hand shot up from the front row, a wiry journalist in a blue shirt. "What about Grayson Monroe? Is the company pressing charges?" Dorian didn't blink. "He will face the law like any other citizen." The room stiffened. Journalists exchanged looks. No deflection, no delay, just a fact. Another voice called out softer this time. "And your son? How is he doing?" For a moment, the steel in Dorian's eyes melted just slightly, his lips pressed into a thin line. Then he answered, "He's healing and stronger than most adults I know." Click, click, click. The sound of camera shutters returned, but they no longer felt invasive. They were documenting something different now. An airline in the process of transformation. A man publicly choosing accountability. As Dorian turned away from the podium, Vernon stepped forward to intercept a cluster of questions. Dr. Knox nodded once to a man in the back who began distributing press kits. Everything was coordinated. Everything was deliberate. Meanwhile, 2 floors above, Malik Benson sat in a quiet lounge overlooking the central courtyard. The walls were high and bright, framed with green plants and soft lighting. He sat curled in a leather chair, a blanket over his legs and a tablet in his hands. The live stream was still playing the press conference wrapping up. He watched as the cameras panned over his father, strong, calm, in control, and something stirred in his chest. He didn't know how to feel. Embarrassed because the world now knew his name for the worst reason imaginable. Proud because his father hadn't backed down. Confused because all he had wanted was to see his dad again, not be at the center of something this huge. The door opened gently. Vernon stepped in carrying a bottle of water and a familiar half-smile. He walked over, handed Malik the drink, and sat on the nearby couch without speaking. For a long minute, they just listened to the faint buzz of the TV. Finally, Malik turned. "Do you think people will believe me?" Vernon's smile deepened. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "They already do," he said quietly with absolute certainty. Malik looked back at the screen one more time. His father was no longer visible, the feed cutting to talking heads analyzing every word, but he didn't need to hear more. He felt it. His truth had landed, and the world was listening now. And now the people were watching every move the airline made. Grayson sat stiffly at the defendant's table, hands clasped, the dull clink of the cuffs around his wrists, hidden from the public eye. The courtroom was hushed thick with the kind of silence that preceded either redemption or ruin. Malik Benson walked in quietly, accompanied by a court officer. His steps were measured, almost too calm for a 12-year-old about to confront the man who had wounded him so deeply. Yet behind the boy's steady pace was a heart pounding against the walls of his chest, each thump reminding him this was real. He approached the witness stand. Every eye in the room followed him. The judge, a stern man named Harold Quinn, motioned gently for him to take a seat. Malik adjusted the microphone with a slight tremble, then looked up at the sea of unfamiliar faces. But one face anchored him, his father's. Dorian Benson sat in the front row, back straight suit, crisp eyes full of quiet fire. Their eyes met, and that was all Malik needed. The prosecutor, Alan Trent, stood and walked toward the witness stand with deliberate steps, his voice calm but firm. "Malik, can you tell the court what happened on Flight 917? Malik took a deep breath. "I was sitting in my seat near the front. The flight attendant, Grayson Monroe, gave me a meal tray. I dropped the fork. I tried to say sorry." He paused, glancing at Grayson briefly. "He stabbed me in the leg with another fork and told me not to talk about it." A ripple of murmurs moved through the courtroom. The judge raised a hand. "Order." Grayson sat motionless, eyes fixed ahead, his face unreadable. The defense attorney, a balding man named Miles Callan, shifted in his chair, already preparing his line of questioning. But it wouldn't matter. The next few moments would decide everything. Trent nodded. "Did he say anything else?" Malik hesitated, then said he threatened me. Told me he'd say I attacked him if I spoke up. "And were you given any medical help during the flight?" "No," Malik replied, voice barely above a whisper. "Not until we landed." Trent looked back at the jury. "That will be all for now." He returned to his table. Callan stood. "Malik, is it possible the fork hit you by accident?" Malik stared at him. "No. Could the turbulence have caused it?" "There was no turbulence when it happened." Callan rubbed his temple. "Is it possible you misunderstood?" "I didn't misunderstand being stabbed," Malik said, his voice steady, now louder. Callan stopped. A moment of silence stretched. Then he sat back down. The prosecutor called the next witness, Vernon Green. Dressed in a dark blue suit, he took the stand confidently and laid out his credentials. Senior tech consultant for Aeromax security systems expert. Then came the footage. The video was played without sound. First Grayson leaning forward, Malik flinching the visible jab, and the moment Malik clutched his leg. Then the audio. Grayson's words hissed through the speakers. "You say one more word and I'll tell everyone you attacked me." The courtroom shifted. Some jurors leaned forward. One of them, a man in his 50s, shook his head slowly. Vernon continued, "I had been hired by Airline to help audit their cybersecurity systems. I recognized Malik from an internal photo Dorian Benson shared during onboarding. That's why I acted. I sent a message directly to Mr. Benson during the flight and preserved this footage through secure servers." Next came Dr. Radon Knox, an independent trauma specialist. He laid out not just what happened, but why it was allowed to happen. Grayson Monroe's actions didn't exist in a vacuum. He stated he had 2 prior complaints, but no consequences. Over the past year alone, 6 complaints involving his behavior were deleted from the airline's database, and who had the authority to delete them? The prosecutor asked. Dr. Knox replied, "Cabin operations leadership." And why would they do that? To protect their numbers, to hide the rot. Kalin objected, but the judge overruled him. Dr. Knox finished his testimony by showing a chart. Crew discipline reports compared across airlines. Airline had the highest dismissal rate of crew complaints and the lowest rate of follow-up action. The system, Knox said, protected people like Mr. Monroe at the expense of passengers, especially vulnerable ones. As closing arguments began, the courtroom felt colder. The jury remained still, absorbing every word. "Ladies and gentlemen," Trent said, walking before them, "this case is not about whether someone lost their temper. It is about a system that allowed violence to take flight. A boy was hurt, not just physically, but emotionally, and that pain was dismissed until the truth found its way into the light." When the jury was dismissed to deliberate, Malik sat quietly beside Dorian in the waiting room. The hall outside buzzed with reporters, the sound muffled by thick courthouse walls. Malik's fingers tapped the armrest of his chair. Dorian placed a steady hand over them. "You were brave up there," he said. "I was scared," Malik admitted. "You still did it. That's what makes it brave." Hours later, the jury filed back in. The foreman stood. The judge asked for the verdict. Guilty on all charges. Grayson didn't speak. He didn't cry. He simply lowered his head. The gavel struck once. The sentence, 4 years in prison and a permanent ban from working in any passenger-related transportation job. Malik didn't look at him as he was led away. Outside the courthouse, cameras snapped, but Dorian gave no speech. He simply placed his hand on Malik's shoulder and guided him through the crowd in silence. They entered the waiting car, neither saying a word until they reached their new home. That evening, Malik sat beside his father on the living room couch, wrapped in a blanket, a warm cup of tea in his hands. "Dad," he said softly, "do you think people will stop being cruel like that?" Dorian looked at his son, his voice calm, his eyes thoughtful. "Some won't, but if people like you keep telling the truth, more will be afraid to try." And that's how a 12-year-old made an entire system change. The question came without warning. "Can you tell us about a time you were brave?" the teacher asked, glancing around the classroom filled with posters of famous leaders and quotes about character. Malik Benson, now back in school for nearly 3 months, felt his heart skip a beat. He sat quietly at his desk, eyes on the blank sheet in front of him. Other students had already begun scribbling answers, but Malik's pen hadn't moved. His right leg, still healing, was stretched out slightly beneath the desk. The dull ache of scar tissue, a constant reminder of what had happened. Mr. Carter, a tall, composed history teacher with streaks of gray in his beard, walked past his row. "You okay, Malik?" he asked softly. Malik nodded. "Yes, sir. Just thinking." Mr. Carter gave a small, respectful nod and moved on. The classroom buzzed with the sound of pencil scratching paper. Malik's fingers gripped his pen, and for a moment he thought about writing it all down. The flight, the stabbing, the courtroom. But something held him back. It wasn't fear. It was choice. He didn't want to be remembered just for surviving something awful. He wanted to be remembered for what he did after. Outside, rain tapped against the window panes, and a breeze pushed faint clouds across the gray sky. Malik took a breath, steady and calm, and started to write. 3 months had passed since the trial. In that time, Malik had gone from being a name whispered in courtrooms to a name spoken with reverence in boardrooms. Quietly, without fanfare, his story had become part of Romax's transformation. Under Dorian Benson's leadership, the Clean Skies Initiative had shifted from press release to practice. 12 employees had been removed, some for past complaints, others for negligence. New hires brought younger, more ethically driven leaders into the fold. Every flight attendant now went through empathy-based training, and each aircraft had been upgraded with new oversight tablets that allowed passengers to anonymously report mistreatment. Yet for Malik, real change wasn't measured by policy. It was in the hallways of his middle school, where classmates didn't whisper or gawk like before. It was in the simple way his teachers spoke to him, not as a news headline, but as a boy who had walked through fire and kept walking. The limp was still there, mostly in the mornings, and the scar on his leg, a narrow line etched just above the knee, would probably stay forever. But when Malik looked at it, he didn't just see pain anymore. He saw proof that he hadn't let the pain win. One Friday morning, Mr. Carter asked for volunteers to present their courage essays. A few hands went up, boys talking about standing up to bullies moving to new cities, helping a sick grandparent. Malik listened, nodded, even smiled, but he remained silent until Mr. Carter looked at him again. "Malik," he asked, "would you like to share?" A beat of silence fell. Malakita could feel the weight of attention turn toward him. For a second, he thought about saying no, but then he saw Mr. Carter's face, calm, encouraging, expectant. Malik stood slow and careful. His leg tensed slightly, but he didn't flinch. He walked to the front of the class. The room was still. Even the usual side whispers had stopped. He didn't need his paper. When someone powerful thinks they can hurt you and get away with it, Malik began, his voice low but steady. It's easy to feel small. His classmates leaned forward, listening closely. They count on you being quiet. They count on you being scared. But sometimes all it takes is one truth, one voice to shake their whole world. He looked around the room, letting the silence settle like dust after a storm. Mr. Carter, who had been leaning against the whiteboard, turned away briefly and wiped under his glasses. And that's when Malik realized he wasn't just a victim. He was proof that justice works when you don't stay silent. The curtain dropped. A breathless silence washed over the crowd gathered on the tarmac outside Terminal 6, the new heart of Aeromax rebirth. Standing in the golden light of late afternoon, every guest executive and employee turned their eyes to the aircraft that had just been unveiled. There it was, sleek silver, modern, a symbol of change. But it wasn't the engineering that drew gas. It was what had been painted across the body of the plane, just behind the cockpit window in bold navy blue lettering. The M. Benson Initiative. The applause came seconds later. Hesitant at first, then swelling into a rolling wave. Photographers scrambled for angles. Reporters whispered urgently into microphones. Cameramen captured the moment as it spread like fire across social media feeds. But none of that reached Malik Benson's ears. He stood frozen near the edge of the stage, eyes wide, staring at the name printed across the aircraft's body. His name. His father stepped beside him, a proud but composed figure in a charcoal gray suit. Dorian Benson didn't say anything at first. He simply held Malik's hand, not as the CEO of an airline, but as a father who had kept a promise. Then he gently guided Malik forward toward the microphone position center stage. Malik's legs trembled slightly, not from pain this time, but from the weight of attention. Cameras zoomed in, crowd hushes deepened, and for a moment the only sound was the distant hum of a ground crew engine. Dorian crouched beside him, one hand on his shoulder, the other gesturing toward the aircraft behind them. "This is yours," Dorian said softly, his voice just loud enough to be caught by the mic, but intimate enough that only Malik seemed to truly hear it. "Every plane we launch under the new code of conduct will carry your name because this company doesn't exist without your courage." Malik blinked once, twice. His throat tightened. The knot in his chest swelled as he looked up at his father's steady face. "I didn't do anything big," he whispered. "You told the truth," Dorian replied, squeezing his shoulder. "That's the biggest thing anyone can do." Behind them, a panel of Aeromax executives stood still. One of them, Vernon Knox, had tears in his eyes but didn't move to wipe them. He understood what this meant, what it cost. what it was about to change. Malik finally stepped toward the podium. His voice wasn't loud, but it was clear. "I didn't know my name was going to be on a plane," he said, glancing up briefly. "I just wanted people to believe me." The crowd remained utterly silent, listening. "I thought being hurt meant you had to stay quiet. But sometimes when you speak up, people finally look." The applause came again, this time softer, less for celebration and more for respect. Malik stepped back, and Dorian wrapped an arm around his shoulder. He guided him to the edge of the stage as cameras flashed once more. Then away from the microphones, Dorian bent down and whispered, "This isn't a thank you. This is a reminder that even giants can fall when the smallest voice speaks up." In that moment, surrounded by flashes of applause and the humming engines of a new future, Malik understood something powerful. He didn't need revenge. He didn't need fame. He just needed to know that the next time a kid like him boarded a plane, no one would ever dare raise a fork again. And the skies were never the same after that. He stabbed the wrong child and answered to the one man who now signs his paychecks. If you stand for justice, strength, and respect, hit subscribe and join the channel. Together we rise. Disclaimer. The story you just watched is fictional, created to highlight the consequences of abuse, discrimination, and unchecked cruelty. Its purpose is to inspire conversations about justice, accountability, and the urgent need for safety, respect, and equality in all environments.